Thanks everyone for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce DT Max today to talk about, in my opinion, one of the best writers of the generation, David Foster Wallace, who, as you presumably know, is the author of Infinite Jest, A Broom in the System, Oblivion, a supposedly wonderful thing I'll never do again, and a handful of other somewhat seminal works of the late 20th century. It would be a bit of a Herculean task to document his life in such an enthusiastic and exhaustively researched fashion. But I think, as Dave Eggers put it, we should feel grateful that this story was told by someone as talented and as responsible as DT Max, which I agree. So, ladies and gentlemen, DT Max.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks to Google for bringing me here, actually just from Stanford, where I have a fellowship this week. Can everybody hear okay? We're all good on that front? So I don't know how much you all know about David Foster Wallace, but I'm going to work on the basis that you at least know something if you're here, because there's lots of other places that you could also be at this hour. And I'm aware that we have exactly 1 hour, is that right? And that you all will begin to sort of bleed away at like 5 of for your next next place you have to be. Well, so Wallace, right, author of Infinite Jest, as Chris said, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant novelist. I'm going to read you a short section from the book, and I'm going to do that just so you get a sort of a sense of my approach to biography, which is maybe a little bit different than what you might expect. And this section I'm going to read to you is from when David is, he's about 29 years old, and he is not yet the world-famous author of Infinite Jest. He's, in fact, a kind of beaten up, tired, and exhausted kind of failed graduate student in Cambridge, Massachusetts. What happens is that David, he grows up in the Midwest in Champaign-Urbana. His father's a professor of philosophy. His mother's a really, really, really overqualified teacher at Parkland Community College. She's an English teacher. English is a foreign language, I think, primarily, but she is certainly as big a talent as David's father was, just in a smaller stage. And David is pretty easily, he's pretty quickly noticed in Urbana as one of the smarter kids around, but not the smartest. He does not graduate at the top of his class. In fact, he grows smarter and smarter, and he goes to college. He goes to Amherst, where his father went. And David begins to have both enormous academic success and enormous emotional problems, sort of at the same time. I suppose most of you probably know that David committed suicide in 2008. He had a lifelong depression, which was treated successfully for part of his life. And at the very end of his life, because he wasn't writing well anymore, he decided to go off of the antidepressant that he'd been on for about 20 years and was never able to kind of restabilize. Treating depression is in a lot of ways, I think, more an art than a science. But that's all later. Right now, David has published an early work, which Chris says is the only book of Wallace's he has not read, called Broom of the System. That's David's first novel, which I absolutely adore. So we'll have to quarrel over that afterward when the camera's off. And then he writes a book called Girl with Curious Hair, which is an absolutely fascinating, almost academic approach to postmodernist fiction, an attempt to understand like why. Well, what postmodernist fiction is? A fiction of Pynchon. You guys have this extreme reading thing going on. It's a lot of your extreme reading type people. Your Gaddis and your Pynchon and your Richard Powers and John Barth, Donald Barthelme. Anyway, David has an enormous success with that first book when he's still in graduate school, and the second book does nothing at all. It basically completely disappears. It throws David into a crisis because the only thing that worries David Foster Wallace more than success is failure. And so David winds up really partially for self-medication and partially, I think, because he's so disappointed in what's going on with his writing, becoming both an alcoholic and a pot addict. He's sort of been a pot addict since high school, really. And it's essentially a form of self-medication, I would say. But he winds up unable to write anymore. He's written the second book, and the second book is brilliant, but it also sort of closes, it's hard to explain, it sort of closes all the possible doors in fiction for him. David feels as if he's written the last thing he needs to write. So at the age of 29, unfortunately, he's a writer who no longer has anything he wants to write. It's a very uncomfortable position. And he decides to change careers. And being the smartest guy in any room, he decides he's going to become a philosophy professor, but he's going to go to Harvard, even though he's been out of school for like 7 or 8 years, or at least out of undergraduate life. He's going to go and be a philosophy professor, and he goes to Harvard. And Harvard philosophy classes are like boot camp. I mean, graduate school there is as difficult as med school. And David is no longer a guy with the focus. I mean, this is a guy who's both an addict and a writer. 2 lousy preparations for graduate school, if you ask me. I don't know which one is worse. And so poor David lasts all of 3 weeks. And being a very smart guy, you know, when all this book comes out of originally a New Yorker piece I wrote shortly after David's death in 2008. And at that time, I thought that David had, basically, he goes to the Harvard Health Services and announces that he's thinking of committing suicide. And he had tried to commit suicide earlier. It was a very credible threat. And at that point, it activates a series of protocols, and David is whisked away from Harvard to McLean Psychiatric Hospital, which is a Harvard-associated facility. And I kid you not, if David had to go to a psychiatric facility, it had to be Harvard. Like, he would accept nothing but the best. And so he goes, you know, in a course of 3 days from being a Harvard philosophy student, a failed Harvard philosophy student, really, to a resident of McLean where he dries out. And after about a month at McLean, he's fully expecting to go back and be a Harvard philosophy student again because, you know, it's all Harvard, right? It's like, you know, why not? But it turns out they're not going to let him go back. That if he's serious about kicking his addiction, he's got to go to a halfway house. And a halfway house is basically a facility, you know, they're strange facilities. They're usually paid for by the state, sometimes by insurance. But the main goal there is to achieve a mindset where when you go back out in the world, you're no longer an addict. So David winds up at a halfway house called Granada House, and that's what I'm going to read you from. And since there seems to be no flat surface here, I'm going to put this over here. Good. That one worked. All right, so here we are. David's 28. He's a failed author. He doesn't know what to write anymore, and he goes to a very, very rough halfway house. And anyone who's read Infinite Jest will recognize immediately the halfway house is fictionalized. It really takes up almost half of Infinite Jest. Let me check the time. All right, we're good. Granada House was on the grounds of the Brighton Marine Hospital near the Massachusetts Turnpike. Wallace found it funny that a marine hospital would be nowhere near water. The compound consisted of 7 buildings, 7 moons orbiting a dead planet, as he would later describe it in Infinite Jest, all leased to various substance abuse groups. Wallace met Deb Larson, the director, at his new temporary home. Tall and blonde, she walked with a limp. Drunk, she had fallen down in her kitchen, hitting her head, causing a partial paralysis. Even then, she hadn't stopped drinking. Wallace respected and liked her immediately. She was pretty and smart and gave him a link to an old life that was still his present. You could almost see Harvard from the top floor of the building. And it's true, I've been to the halfway house has moved, but if you go to the halfway house, it is really just across the Charles River from everything that David held dear. And you sense how bizarre it would be for him to sort of have gone from one to the other in a month. Recovery facilities tried to control the stress levels of their participants. And one activity that they generally prohibited was school. Wallace had no choice but to call the philosophy department at Harvard and ask for leave of absence. He was too humiliated to go back and get the vegetable juicer, a gift from his mother that he had left behind in the department office. Now he was expected to find low-level work. Wallace, whose only experience was essentially teaching and writing, cast around and was able, probably thanks to the presence of the head of Amherst College security on his resume, to get hired as a guard at Lotus Development, a large software company. Anyone remember Lotus? Lotus people? Okay. All right, good. Sorry. Couldn't resist. Granada House rules stipulated a 40-hour work week. So Wallace got up at 4:30 in the morning to take the Green Line and worked until 2 p.m., walking a vast disc packaging plant in Lechmere, clocking in his whereabouts every 10 minutes and twirling his baton. Or so he later said. Actually, I don't think David ever did this, but it's in the letters he wrote. What I think he actually did, because there are other letters that he wrote, which I was given. I think what he actually did is he sat in a chair and watched a video monitor, just like every other security guard that you've ever seen. But for David, it was all about sort of fictionalizing the experience, as you'll find out. And for him, it was far more kind of appealing that he would be a character out of really a Keystone Cops movie, you know, twirling his baton and punching in the clock. But I don't think he did it. He would tear pages out of his notebook and send letters to his friends, maintaining contact with a small group of editors and writers who were vital to him. The Lotus experience, he recalled in the later interview, reminded him of every bad 60s novel about meaningless authority. You guys reading Catch-22, right? In this group? Yeah, so there's your, well, not a bad 60s, anyway, you get the idea. But at the time, he bore it exceptionally well. Give me a little time to get used to no recreational materials, and wearing a polyester uniform, and living with 4 tattooed ex-cons, and I'll be right as rain, he wrote a friend with ironic brio shortly after. But in his heart, he was stunned. I am, he wrote one of his Amherst professors, okay, though very humiliated and confused. He was sharing a barracks-like room with 4 men, one of whom, he wrote Rich C., had had a stroke while on cocaine and had a withered right side. Mr. Howard, he told his editor at W. Norton, the book publisher, everyone here has a tattoo or a criminal record or both. To his professor, he reported, most of the guys in the house are inmates on release. And while they're basically decent folk, it's just not a crowd I'm much at home with. Heavy metal music, black T-shirts and Harleys, vivid tattoos, discussion of hard verse soft time, parole boards, gunshot wounds, and Walpole, Massachusetts' toughest prison. One of my examples of the fact that David was always a writer, even in this moment when he's just absolutely destitute, is these letters that he wrote from the halfway house are amazing. I mean, I love the fact that in writing this letter, he bothers to sort of put in the word vivid for vivid tattoos. You know, that's a writer, you know, no matter what. If the tattoo looked a certain way, he had to tell everybody about it. Wallace continued at a security job for more than 2 months, and then, unable to bear getting up so early, he quit. He went to work as a front desk attendant at the Mount Auburn Club, a health club in nearby Watertown. His job was to check members in. He called himself a glorified towel boy. But one day, Michael Ryan, a poet who had received a Whiting Award alongside him 2 years before, came into exercise. Wallace dove below the reception desk and quit the same day. His friends were accustomed to his exaggerations and inventions over the years. They came with his clownish, hyperbolic personality. But when they visited him at the halfway house, they found that what he had said was actually true. He had stepped through the looking glass. His friend Deborah Spark, a fiction writer, remembers sitting in on a group therapy session with Wallace one day, being amazed to hear someone recount killing someone else while drunk. All the same, Wallace found his place. Order, no matter how far in the context, was always easier for him than the unstructured world that lay outside. He met with a counselor, and nearly every evening he drove to a different part of the city with other halfway house members for substance abuse meetings. His sponsor was named Jimmy, a motorhead from the South Shore, as Wallace called him in a letter. And Wallace read the big book, the founding text of Alcoholics Anonymous, and enjoyed making fun of its cheesy 1930s ad man vocabulary to his friends. Tosspot, Dave Sheen heels, boiled as an owl. He laughed at them, but he also knew he needed them or he would die, Mark Costello, his college roommate, remembers. And if Wallace found himself in unfamiliar territory, the residents didn't know what to make of him either. One remembers wondering, this guy could probably go to Betty Ford. Why is he here with us welfare babies? No one really cared for his cleverness. He was to them a type they'd seen before, someone who, as Wallace would later write in Infinite Jest, tries to erect denial-type fortifications with some kind of intellectualist showing off. Wallace was back in high school, trying to figure out his place in the pack. It's a rough crowd, he wrote his old Arizona sponsor, and sometimes I'm scared, or feel superior, or both. Yet a piece of him was beginning to adjust to the new situation. He remembered his last failed attempt to get sober, and how he was no longer writing, and asked himself, what was it he had to lose? He came to understand that the key this time was modesty. He knew it was imperative to abandon the sense of himself as the smartest person in the room, a person too smart to be like one of the people in the room because he was one of the people in the room. I try hard to listen and do what they say, he wrote Rich C. I'm trying to do it easy this time, not get an A+. I just don't have enough gas right now to do anything fast or well, and I'm trying to accept this. Not that things came easily. The simple aphorisms of the program seemed ridiculous to him, and if he objected to them, someone inevitably answered him with another, telling him, for example, to do what was in front of him to do, or to take it one day at a time, driving him even crazier. He was astonished to find people talking about a higher power without any evidence beyond their wish that there should be one. They got down on their knees and said the thankfulness prayer. Wallace tried once at Granada House, he told his friend Mark Costello, but it felt hypocritical. All the same, he liked to quote one of the veteran recovery members, the group known in Infinite Jest as the Crocodiles, who used to say, it's not about whether or not you believe, asshole. It's about getting down on your knees and asking. There were many times when he was sure he would start drinking again. I'm scared, he wrote his old Arizona sponsor. I still don't know what's going to happen. He asked his friend for some words of encouragement, and just when he thought he would give up, a letter arrived in which his former sponsor recounted the last time he had been in detox. They gave me Librium, he wrote, and I threw them over my left shoulder for luck, and I've had good luck ever since. The image, Wallace wrote his sponsor years later in thanks, was just the good MFA caliber trope I needed. Stunned as he was, Wallace understood from the beginning that his fall from grace was also a literary opportunity. He had been hypothesizing beforehand about a nation enthralled to its appetites, and here he was living among its casualties. So in the midst of his misery, he was alive to the new information that he was getting. The communal house, he would later write in Infinite Jest, reeks of passing time. It is the humidity of early sobriety, hanging and palpable. Wallace was known for sitting quietly, listening as residents talked for hours about their lives and their addictions. Later, residents would often be surprised to find that though he had heard their stories, they had not actually heard his. This was the sort of access to interior lives of a novel. This was the sort of access to interior lives that a novelist could not get elsewhere. I always think there's a story about Vladimir Nabokov. Is he in the extreme curriculum? No. Vladimir Nabokov, anyway, he wrote the book Lolita, which is about really an 11-year-old girl, the famous nymphette of the title. And he had no idea how 11-year-old girls spoke. I mean, he had just no idea. You'd be amazed how hard it is, either as a journalist or a novelist, to actually catch uninflected speech. Because, you know, when you enter the room, you change the conversation, right? So Nabokov used to get on the school bus in the town where he lived, I think it was Ithaca, and he would hide behind the back seat with a notepad and scribble down all the little things the 11-year-old said. I mean, these days, that could get you arrested, but it was a more innocent time. Wallace was finding, as he later told an interviewer, that nobody is as gregarious as somebody who has recently stopped using drugs. Wallace and his notebooks were a familiar sight in the communal rooms and recovery meetings, trapping little inspirations before they could get away. Within a few months of arriving, he had already drafted a scene centered on one of the most intriguing residents at Granada House, Big Craig. Big Craig, Don Gately in the novel, was one of the Granada House supervisors and sometimes the house cook. And anyone who's read the book, there's a beautiful moment where this massive guy is sort of ladling out these overcooked noodles, I think it is, and he's really proud of his cooking. That's the beautiful touch of it, is that he really thinks he's achieved something in the kitchen. Craig was in his mid-20s, sober and just huge, as Wallace would later write in Infinite Jest, looking less built than poured, with the smooth immovability of an Easter Island statue. And that is, by the way, all exactly how Big Craig looked. I had assumed that was, one of the tricky things about David Foster Wallace is that the nonfiction is often embellished. The fiction is often actually reported. And in this case, Big Craig sent me a picture of all things of him and David and a couple of other residents of the halfway house on a fishing cruise, which I had no idea that you could be in a halfway house and charter a boat and go fishing, but apparently you can. And Big Craig looks so much like Don Gately in the novel. Remember, there's a description of Don Gately in the novel as having a Prince Valiant haircut. What is a Prince Valiant haircut? But it's true. I mean, Don Gately has like he really looks like Prince. He has a few little sort of strands of hair going down, and he looks exactly like Prince Valiant. And he looks, it's hard to explain how a person can look more poured than built. But he has sort of a lack of sharp angles, and so you have this massive head and then these tremendous shoulders coming down, a huge torso. Best part of all is he's wearing a Harvard College sweatshirt, which he clearly swapped with David for something far tougher like a Walpole. He'd been in prison, I mean, obviously David wanted to be tough, and the Don Gately character was thrilled to be in the presence of of this character who had wandered from Harvard across the river. Craig had grown up on the North Shore and been a burglar and Demerol addict. Friends closed elevator doors on his head for fun when he was a teenager, a detail Wallace would, of course, put into Infinite Jest, too. But he turned out not only to come from a different world, but also to be quite sensitive. And it did not take Wallace long to see the possibilities in a lug with an interior life. There was a sort of Dostoyevskian gloss to him, the redeemed criminal, and Dostoyevsky was on Wallace's mind. He wrote to his amorous professor shortly after arriving that going from Harvard to here is like House of the Dead, with my weeks in drug treatment composing the staged execution and last-minute reprieve from same. The reprieve, he hoped, would spur the same creative surge as it had in the Russian. Thank you. So that's the reading. And now we throw it open to questions, and if there are no real questions, Chris has promised to throw in a couple of potted questions to kind of, break the ice. And there's a microphone for all who do have questions, and I'm going to get my iced tea again, because there are no flat surfaces at this lectern. No, there is one, but that would ruin the visual. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, and
Hi.
thanks for coming.
Yeah, sure.
I was interested in Wallace's relationship to fame and being in the spotlight. There are a number of passages in the book where he alternately seems completely comfortable and like he controls the room, and then a puddle of sweat who wants to avoid all attention. So did you see in your research that he changed in that way over the course of his life? It was hard for me to get.
When you refer to the passages where he's comfortable, is that from a book or from something you've seen
Like
on?
one of the first readings he did, I think you say that he was extremely comfortable on stage. I think he read Fourth, and they said he owned the room.
Right,
You know,
right.
something like the literary event where he's premiering.
Yeah.
I guess it was Broom or Girl.
It was Broom, yeah.
And then he's hiding in the back the whole time, and there are rumors going on about him.
Yeah, but before he sort of, this is in, I think, 1987, David's first public reading in New York for Broom of the System. And, he apparently was just this incredible reading where he just totally mesmerized everybody. But beforehand at the restaurant where he went with his editor and the other writers, he was excusing himself every 5 minutes to go vomit in the bathroom. I think that he was shy, but he was also somebody desperate for public love. And when you're shy and desperate for public love, you get into a very difficult situation where, you both really want to read in public, but you also are sort of dreading the experience. And I think, one of the things about David is that he really, everyone says, oh, he didn't want to be famous. David wanted to be famous. I mean, David desperately wanted readers. He wanted fame. There's an early letter. One of the really fun things about writing the biography was that people gave me lots and lots of his correspondence. One of the weird things about correspondence is you don't think about it unless you're a writer or a public figure, but it's the letters that you send out, those are the ones the biographer wants, and those are in other people's hands. So you don't have to save your correspondence. And in fact, David saved almost nothing. But all these people saved David's letters. So David's voice for me was, captured in all these moments. I mean, I'm a writer who's very, very interested in voice. You can hear all the letters, even in the little section that I read to you. There's an early letter where he asks, he's just gotten Broom of the System accepted for publication, and he was a whopping 24 years old, I think. And he writes one of his friends from Amherst and asks his friend to insert a mention in the Amherst Alumni Bulletin without letting the Amherst Alumni Bulletin editor know that he was behind it. I mean, David really, really craved fame. And then when he got fame, he found it was very, very uncomfortable. He just never really understood what his value was. And I think for him, things got very confusing when people would come up to him and say, oh, you're David Foster Wallace. He would always say, no, I'm David Wallace. That's my writing name. Not D.T. Max, Daniel Max. Like this distinction. And the only thing that bothered him more than being noticed, of course, was not being noticed. So for instance, with Girl with Curious Hair, that was a book that sold, I think, 2,200 copies in hardcover, which is really, almost not being published at all in America. You can imagine you could put 2,200 copies in a closet practically, and that devastated him. And yet, when Infinite Jest is published, and it's this enormous hit, like this phenomenon, and in some ways realizes all of David's dreams, it also becomes his nightmare. And later on, he's unable to write, in part because he feels like he's being haunted by the specter of this novel that was such a success, and everybody will expect another brilliant, brilliant novel from him. The whole sort of dichotomy is summarized very well he was interviewed by a very, very good interviewer named Larry McCaffrey, I think in 1991. And McCaffrey asked him about fame, and David said something. He said, I'm an exhibitionist who wants to hide but fails at hiding, therefore somehow I succeed. So that was his own very meta, very David Foster Wallace. And then the best part is when he got the transcript of the interview to approve, because it was that sort of interview, he cut that line. So he hit again.
Were you surprised by anything you learned over the course of doing research for the book?
I was surprised by so much. There's two stages to the book. The book begins as a New Yorker article. I'm a staff writer at the New Yorker, and so I was asked by the editor of the magazine, shortly after David's death, did I want to write about David? And I can't tell you, I'd read Wallace's writing and always loved Broom of the System. Sorry, Chris, I did. It was my favorite book. It's a free country. So, And I was horrified in the early research on the book to discover a letter from David to Jonathan Franzen, the novelist, where he says to Franzen that, this is like in 1991, it's like 4 years after Boom of the System, he says that he finds nothing to like in the book. It could have been written by a smart 14-year-old. And I was horrified. He didn't even say a very smart 14-year-old. So I had invested all this love in this thing that he looked on as sort of juvenilia. But I knew nothing about David. I didn't know about his depression. I didn't know about his addiction history. I didn't know about his struggles. Struggles with women is really the wrong phrase, but his difficulty with women. I didn't know about his. I didn't know that he was vastly overdue on a last novel, which would be The Pale King, the book that was finally published. I didn't know, and on a deeper level, I didn't really know how deeply he suffered. I didn't know that ever since he'd been in high school, he'd experienced other anxiety, depression. And on the flip side, I also didn't know how funny he was. I mean, one of the things, when I was done with one of the reasons I continued and did the book after the New Yorker piece, because you can stop. You've had your flirtation, and you can go on and do something else. I mean, it's one of the nice things about a magazine article, even a long one. And I remember thinking a couple of things. The article came out about 6 months after David's death. And one thing was, I kept wishing I could still read David Foster Wallace. Like, why did I have to go and read other people? I was really hooked by the voice. I'd always liked David's writing, even loved some of it. But it really began to inhabit me in a way that may be familiar to some of you. Like, it really became the voice in my head, which is the miracle of David, is it's the voice in your head. If it works for you, he's not just a writer. He becomes the voice in your head. Almost like he appropriates your brain. And you see everything the way David would have seen. I mean, I walk around now and I can look at, this room, and I'm having David type thoughts. Or I get on an airplane, and David is a wonderful description of the people who, I can't remember it offhand, but the people who pretend they're in no hurry, so they let everyone else rush off the airplane, and then they like gather up their bags and sort of pretend to sort of saunter off, and how like what a thin facade that is. Like they're actually having no more fun than anyone else on an airplane. Or David, I was on the airplane flying out west, and there was a Gwyneth Paltrow movie, and I used to like Gwyneth Paltrow. And David says in some letter that I have, it's actually not in the book, but he describes her as looking like the ghost of a horse. And now I can't get it out of my head. Like, even though she's a perfectly good actress, like, okay, there's the ghost of a horse. Or there's a wonderful phrase about babies. This is, I think, a conversation he had with his friend Mark Costello, where he says, he says, babies are famous to themselves. And I think that's such a perfect way to capture the way that babies have their own kind of little ego sphere. There's nothing can make a baby upset. Like, if a baby is happy despite anything going on around him or her. And I just think he was this incredible observer. So I didn't want to read anyone else. I didn't really want to talk to. I didn't want to do anything else. And then second, it was clear that David had, and I think his death accelerated this, but I don't think it originated it. He'd begun to kind of capture just an amazing number of readers and people, not just as a writer, because to be honest, an 1,100-page book is always going to have limitations on its readership, like a difficult, and I don't think it's as difficult as people think it is. You guys have had it already, right? It was part of the, so it's a book where it's hard to orient yourself, but it doesn't actually present the obstacles, say, Finnegan's Wake presents. He wanted readers. David always wanted readers. The great battle for David was between making it too easy, which would make it part of our addictive culture, and too difficult, which means you wouldn't, he had to calibrate the medicine perfectly. But after his death, it was incredible how people were just online talking about missing David Foster Wallace in the world in a way that I don't think I'd really entirely understood when he was alive. If you go online, you can see people with tattoos that say, this is water, which is the name of the wonderful sort of commencement address he gave in 2005 at Kenyon College. Some people have the date they started Infinite Jest and the date they finished Infinite Jest on their arms. This is not a normal response to a writer. It's really a response to a kind of a person who clearly is reaching people in a whole bigger and more thoroughgoing way. And so I never wanted to write a biography, what I would call an aesthete's biography, a biography about how beautiful someone else wrote, because the contradiction in that is sort of obvious, like, or the disconnect is, well, it's like going to an art gallery and saying, oh, that painting's so beautiful. What can you do when faced with beauty, except acknowledge beauty? But, you know, with David, there was a whole question about, like, who is this moral being? This seer, in a sense, who's grown up around us. You know, there's this cliche of, like, Saint Dave. The idea that there's this person who really understood us and our generation or generations and our modern life and our media-saturated life and our computer-saturated life. There's a wonderful line from David that's in his notebooks. He says, "Would that we scrutinized our technology with the same care we give to our people." And I thought that was really, you know, an interesting observation. So I just wanted to keep going. Like, it just had to be what I did. And, you know, it was in some sense a voyage for me of exploration, a voyage of love. I mean, I loved David when I began. There's a lot of things in the book that probably David would not have been thrilled to have in a book. But I mean, I emerged more in love. I mean, more. I don't think that a seer or whatever you want to call David today has to be a person. I mean, I think the model is Thomas Merton. I don't know how many of you have ever read Thomas Merton, but there's absolutely extraordinarily sort of chaotic life that leads to some sort of clarity at the end. But what makes David more special for me than Thomas Merton, you know, Thomas Merton had a very secular life, and then he became a Catholic. I think he became a monk, right? I believe. But David found, to my mind, a harder route. He became a kind of secular, or tried to become it, because it was always about trying with David. Tried to become a kind of secular saint, somebody who, you know. And so when he died, everyone was like, "Well, the world feels emptier without him. I don't understand how to live in this world without him." And that was really meaningful to me. I mean, that really clinched my need to write about him and sort of think about him.
Yeah, I have a question about the Pale King and kind of how the themes fit in with his battle with depression. You know, a lot of the novel is concerned with, you know, finding meaning in the mundane and the really boring and everyday. I mean, even if that one character who's like achieves like a nirvana and is like,
yeah, Drinyan, he levitates. He's
levitating while he's doing his like tax auditing. So and then the fact that he, you know, committed suicide in the midst of writing that, does that kind of represent to you like a failure to find that meaning?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. You know, for me, okay, so the story is The Pale King, and The Pale King, I don't know how many of you read it, it was published after David's death, is really about trying to sort of find some sort of larger, almost Buddhist comfort or space in the midst of our kind of totally noisy, totally crowded landscape. And for David, I mean, the metaphor was obvious. Like, it was also about being a writer. Like, what does a writer do but try and push away all the ancillary noise to find your own, you know, your own sweet spot as a writer. And so it's a kind of a treble failure in the sense that, you know, he didn't finish the book. He went off of an antidepressant in order to try to finish the book, because some antidepressants, or I think actually most, make the people who take them feel, you know, in some way sort of a little bit distant, like there's a little bit of a kind of a divider between themselves and the world. And David felt that, and he felt it was interfering with his writing. You know, I wouldn't use the word failure. I think what David's death and the non-completion of The Pale King show us is just how damn hard it is. You know, I mean, first of all, he took the kind of project that nobody should take on, you know, without a physician's certificate, which is, okay, I mean, what writing and literature and novels and fiction are, on one level, a form of entertainment, or at least they have to interest you, right? So if you write a novel about boredom, there's a contradiction right in there, right? Built in there is the contradiction that if I'm really going to capture boredom for you or mindfulness, it's going to be so quiet that you're not going to want to read the book. I mean, you're going to put it on your chest, you know, every night, and, you know, call it infinite rest. I mean, it would be a book you would never, it would be a book you'd never finish. So anyway, that's part of this battle that he fights. One of the curious things about the book, I was just recently in the archives. David's papers are in Austin at the University of Texas. If anybody goes there and has any interest in David, you know, they have a very good access system. You don't have to be a bona fide scholar, whatever that is. And I really recommend going and looking at the drafts of Infinite Jest. It's really stunning to see it. But in the early versions of the book, Drinyan is actually an actor in porn movies. And so the book somehow goes on this long journey from him being, you know, a symbol of kind of the profane to some sort of symbol of the sacred. I mean, it's an enormous, you know, it's less contradictory than you think, because Drinyan is always somehow otherworldly. I mean, he's part of this technology which I think is invented where that David was deeply interested in porn, which is, I think, a fancy way of saying that he also kind of liked to watch porn. But he was as guilt-obsessed as any, any Midwestern young boy could possibly be with this. And so in the setup for the book, or the original version, Drinyan is somebody you can, using some sort of computer technology, put yourself in his place. So it's you in the porn movie. And so it's Drinyan's very like non-corporeality, if that's a word. It's his lack of bodily embodiment that makes him perfect for the movie. And so in that sense, it's not so different from the Drinyan in The Pale King, who's able to whose interest in people is so intense and so sort of self-encompassing that he literally floats up in the air as he's talking. So I see quarter of, and you guys running on a tight timetable. Do we do one more quickie, if there is one? Do you want to throw a potted one in?
Ask if you found anything that informed, we were talking about female characters, if through your research you found anything that would shed light on how his female characters were portrayed.
Well, I mean, the original sort of rap on David was that he couldn't write women. And in fact, earlier, not now, he was primarily kind of a young man's writer. Sort of in the, I don't know quite who else, maybe, perhaps Pynchon also has that kind of bias. But for whatever reason, I think because David is now known in a certain way as much for the life he tried to live as for exactly what he wrote, interest in him has sort of blossomed way out of the sort of original kind of male kind of, graduate student kind of, demographic. But, David, I don't think, David didn't understand women, I think is probably sort of a fair statement, but I also think it's a fair statement that David didn't really understand men. I mean, he wasn't the guy who drew traditional developed characters. I mean, Don Gately in Infinite Jest or Hal, these are, life for him. One reason I think we read David with more and more intensity now than we did even 15 years ago is because David's idea of what people look like is a little bit the way they come across on a computer. That's a little bit hard for me to break out in the 25 seconds left. But basically, like, the rounded character of Victorian 19th century life is not, that's literally not how David saw the world. David insisted his books were realism, for a world that was no longer real. And if you read Infinite Jest, you can see that in a way it is our life, but it's also not our life. It's different than 19th century fiction. It's different than Charles Dickens. It's different than George Eliot. It's different than Thomas Hardy. But it's also recognizably in their tradition as well. I mean, David never saw himself as experimental. He did not see himself as being like Pynchon or John Barth or he saw himself as a realist. He saw himself as in a different tradition. So I mean, the short answer is that's how he saw women, though that was women to him. The longer answer is, like, did David have a woman problem, a women problem, however you say it? Well, I mean, the women who knew him thought the opposite. I mean, he was famous for it. He was Drinyan-like. He had this ability to focus. And, I can't tell you how many times I would be with a woman who had dated David or whatever, and she would be sitting there, and part of biography is it's not so glamorous. I mean, you go to different towns where people knew the person. You go and you look at the house they lived in. You talk to the people who are willing to talk to you. And they'd be like, David was like a drug to me. And he was. I mean, and some people, some people, many people, like, insist that was also, I think, in some ways part of what limited, he didn't see anybody. You don't go to David for what you get out of, I don't know, I don't want to throw some novelist under the bus here. But you get the idea. Like, you don't go for a fully rounded, modulated figure of somebody who gradually evolves and through a late epiphany in the novel becomes a slightly different person. Alice Munro, I don't know. I mean, she's a wonderful writer, so I don't mean to be putting her down. That's not David. Like, David is, in some ways, he's binary. In some way, he's utterly modern, almost futuristic. That's how he saw all of us. And so, I don't really think it's a gender thing. I think if there's a cliche to be invoked, it's that if you go to fiction, for what, has been the historical role of fiction, you probably emerge slightly disappointed. I'm not saying you're terribly disappointed, because David's a beautiful writer no matter what. But if you go to try to understand, as it were, the news of who we are and what's going on, I mean, in this building, among other places, like, there's no better place to go than David Foster Wallace.
you mentioned the kind of veneration of Saint Dave, which I know is something that Franzen pretty publicly called out in that New Yorker piece about going to grieve and birdwatch. How conscious do you think David was? Did you find any references about like how he wanted to be perceived in terms of his legacy?
Well, I mean, I don't think the whole Saint Dave thing was like something he was really deliberately working on. But I mean, it's such a complicated question. I mean, David wanted to be read. He wanted to be regarded as a writer. I don't think he all that much really was desperate to be regarded as some sort of sage for our time. I think the idea would have made him, as he would have said, run for the bathroom. That said, you know, I mean, he was a contradictory guy like many, many writers. And I mean, he was a, you know, writers are small public figures. I think he was probably aware of the potential. I mean, he only had to see the fact that the generation of writers whom he admired, you know, who were passing, like John Updike, I mean, they had no such public presence. I think a lot of it also happened after his death, to be honest. I think David's suicide really changed the freedom we give ourselves to interpret him, because to some extent he just wasn't there to push back against it anymore. I mean, I can easily imagine that David, had he lived and had this whole Saint Dave thing expanded, he could easily have written some sort of essay about not wanting to be a saint with lots of meta levels and lots of humor, and only after you finish it would you realize that was what it was about. And all the time he'd be wondering, you know, did he want to be a saint? I mean, I'll end with one anecdote, a really small anecdote, which is when David was writing the speech that would be the Kenyon College address, which is really about being mindful. It's an extraordinary, you know, commencement speech, unlike anything you heard at your colleges or I heard at my college, about the need to really be mindful in your life, not just to achieve, but to actually be aware, to be present. So he's writing this speech, and it's really a lot of ways derives from the sort of things he learned in his 12-step program. And they're all the basic cliches that he was fighting so hard against at Granada House, like, you know, do what's in front of you to do, and, you know, that kind of, you know, kind heart will never drink. I don't remember all the exact phrases. But anyway, stuff that would drive him crazy, I mean, really crazy. So he's writing this speech, and it really is, in a sense, one wonderful cliche strung along after another. But when you read it, you'll see the power of it. But he and his wife, Karen, at the time, you know, he and his wife, Karen, while he was writing the speech, that he suggested that maybe she should do a sort of soft shoe routine behind him while he read it. So, like, you know, he'd be saying, you know, the important thing is, you know, to decide what to pay attention to, and if not, you'll be hosed. And there would be, you know, Karen, you know, making fun of the whole thing. He thought at the same time as he thought it was the most important thing he'd ever written, I'm sure he also thought it was like a huge joke. And then any 5-year-old had figured these things out years ago. It's one thing that's interesting about him is that he went on this brilliant guy went on this vast circuit, and in the end comes back to understand the sort of truisms that you're really taught when you're 5 or 6, or in your first Bible class. But it's the struggle, and it's the process, and it's the need that he had to make it clear for himself personally that's so powerful in his story. You know, that's why people want to associate with. We all go on some version of this. I think almost all of us go on some version of the journey he went on. His was more intense, it was more beautifully verbalized, and it had sort of more peaks and valleys, with the dreadful valley at the end. But I think we all recognize this battle to make sense out of the modern world for ourselves. I don't mean in some sort of political way, but in an absolutely personal way.
Well,
thanks.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.